Hi class, it's great to see you again. Welcome to chapter 6 of this course syllabus. So today we're going to be covering demand, supply, and government policies, right? So I've explained briefly what government policies are all about, and today we're going to go into details of two kinds of government policies, right? So specifically we are looking at price controls. And the first type of price control we're going to be looking at is a price ceiling. So remember, a price ceiling is the legal maximum price, and a good example of this is rent control. So the whole idea of price controls is to ensure, for the government to ensure that things are being fairly done in the market and no one is being extorted. Okay, so in this case, the rent control, which is the legal maximum price imposed in the market, it just ensures that landlords do not overcharge tenants, right? So how does it look graphically? So remember, you have your price and you have your quantity, and then you have your equilibrium, okay? So this is your demand and this is your supply. And wherever the demand and supply intersects, that is your equilibrium price and your equilibrium quantity. Okay, so where does the price ceiling come in? So because a price ceiling is a legal maximum, right? Legal maximum, so meaning that they can charge rent, for instance, in rent control, they can charge rent from this amount downwards. They can't charge above this rent. So in that way, the price ceiling is actually going to be below. So take note of this, okay? It's actually going to be below the equilibrium. So meaning that they can charge rent anywhere down, below this point, below the equilibrium point, okay? So this is how the price ceiling works. Now notice where, I'm going to call it PC for price ceiling. Notice where the price ceiling stretches up to. It stretches up to the demand curve. And if you trace it, so your demand curve, you trace it down. So basically what this means is that your demand curve is more than your supply, right? And that makes sense because when the rent becomes cheaper, then tenants are going to be more excited to demand for houses, you understand? So that's going to lead to excess demand over the houses that the landlords are actually willing to sell in the markets, okay? So this whole point is going to be a shortage. So whenever demand exceeds supply, that leads to a shortage in the market. And when there's a shortage in the market, what happens to price? Did you figure it out? Price goes up. Okay, that's what happens. So whenever there's a scarcity of something, then it becomes more costly to get it because of our scarcities, right? So this leads to, eventually in the long run, is going to lead to an increase in the price. Okay? So again, invisible hand is working here. Okay? This is what we call a binding price ceiling. If a price ceiling is not binding, then it's going to be above the equilibrium. Okay? So there's no point in the government implementing a policy if they are not going to enforce it. But just so you know, a non-binding price ceiling is going to be the opposite of a binding price ceiling. So a non-binding price ceiling is going to be somewhere up here, right? Okay, so the next one is what we call a price floor. And a price floor is a legal minimum price. And a good example of this is minimum wage. So basically, again, when you draw your curve, you have your price, you have your quantity, you have your demand, you have your supply, and you have your equilibrium points. So when you say price floor, then you are saying only prices above that should be charged. So in the case of minimum wage, you're saying employers should not pay workers less than a certain amount. So they can pay the minimum wage or anywhere on top of the minimum wage, okay? So in that sense, where do you think the price floor is going to be? You guessed it right, it's going to be opposite, right? So the price floor in that case is going to be binding when it's on top of the equilibrium. So you can charge anywhere or you can pay any wages above this amount, okay? So that is when it's binding. So this is a binding price floor. I'm going to call it PF, okay? All right. And do you see where it stretches up to? It stretches up to your supply curve. So again, that makes sense because when the price is very high, then suppliers are willing to produce more and supply more of that good. In this case, in the labor market, remember that we are the suppliers. So therefore, we are willing to supply more labor, right? So now there's going to be excess supply of labor. Many people are willing to work because the price of the wages are higher, right? And then the supply of labor exceeds the demand for labor. So more people are willing to work than the companies that are willing to hire, right? And when there's a surplus, so this excess points here, between here and here, this excess point is what you call the surplus, right? And when there's a surplus, what that means is eventually in the long run, it's going to result in bringing down the price, okay? So yeah, that is how invisible hand works. And this is how government policies work in terms of price floor and price control, okay? So again, remember, excess surplus over demand means that there's surplus. In this case, that means there's unemployment, okay, in the labor markets, Okay, assuming that this is, for the minimum wage example. Now, there's something else that, and if you haven't figured it out already, when government makes policies, it's often with a good intention to correct maybe a market failure. Maybe the market doesn't balance out itself, and then the government is trying to ensure fairness, and then the government intervenes. Or even things like externality. So when, for instance, factories that produce end up having causing environmental pollution, noise pollution, smoke pollution, all of that, and then the government finds a tax to the factories so that they're able to clean up the waste that they produce to the environment, right? So that's a form of government intervention. So most times government intervention is done to either to encourage equality or to encourage most times to encourage equality, most times, right? But in the process of, remember your trade-off between equality and efficiency. So most times when policies are geared towards encouraging equality, it ends up being inefficient, right? So it ends up causing bias in the market because there's subsequent long-run effects, okay? Now let's talk about tax. What is a tax? I'm sure pretty much all of you are familiar with tax because you pay taxes all the time, either in form of sales tax, which is when you go to the store, you pay it's a sales tax on top of whatever you buy from the store, which goes to the government, right? So there's a sales tax, there's the income tax, which is paid on top of what you earn at your job. So these are examples of taxation. And why does the government impose taxes? It's so that they can use it for public goods and services. So like you have public parks, you have public schools, public education, public hospitals, all of that. Is funded by government taxes, even the roads, the street lights, the roads infrastructure, and all of that. So that is beneficial. However, taxes also cause distortion in the market. In the sense that when the government imposes a tax, oftentimes they impose it on the sellers, and then the sellers pass it on to the buyers in form of higher prices. Now, when the buyers are paying higher prices because of tax, the sellers are also receiving less amount of money because they also have to remit their portion of the tax to the government, right? So let's say we have a price that costs, so let's talk about, your quantity, you have your price, and you have your demand curve, your supply curve, and then let's say the market price initially was $3, and then at $3 you had 20 units of a good being demanded, right? Okay, and assuming now the government decides to impose a tax of $3, okay, that is going to increase the price of the good. It increases the price of the good from $3. It increases it from $3 to $6, okay. But now who bears the burden of the tax? It's going to be a split between the sellers and the buyers. So let's say the sellers decide to bear $1, and then they push on the remaining tax to the buyers in form of $2, okay. So therefore, the buyers are going to end up paying as much as $5 for the tax. And you see that is going to definitely reduce the quantity demanded. And then the sellers, so remember this lower point of the supply curve is the cost of production, okay? So the production costs. All right, and the sellers end up having to pay $2 of the extra tax to the government. So all right, so that's basically how the tax is split between the buyers and the sellers. In this way, you see that the difference between what the buyers pay and the equilibrium price is actually, how much portion of the tax that the buyers are bearing, which is $2, and then the difference between the equilibrium price and what the sellers are actually receiving is the $1 which the sellers have to remit, the $1 of the tax which the sellers have to remit to the government, right? So remember, okay, I haven't mentioned this before, but basically the tax revenue which the government gets is the tax that is imposed times the quantity that is sold, right? So the tax that is imposed is $3. So remember, $2 from the buyers and $1 from the seller, and then the quantity that is being sold at this selling price is probably, let's just say it's 15, right? So 3 times 15, and that's going to give $45 in this hypothetical, very hypothetical example, right? So basically, who is losing in the market? The buyers are losing because the buyers pay more, right? And then the sellers are also losing because the sellers receive less. You see that? So the buyers and the sellers lose consumer surplus. I'm going to call consumer surplus CS and PS, okay? So they lose consumer surplus and producer surplus. So the buyers lose consumer surplus because now they have to pay more, right? And because they're paying more out of pocket, they're losing the gains that they were able to save $2 before, but now they have to pay $2 extra. And the sellers are also receiving less producer surplus because now they are receiving less, okay? And who gains? The government gains. The government is the only one that gains, and they gain the tax revenue. Okay, so now the question is, which one outweighs the other? How much the government gains is actually going to be less than how much the buyers and the sellers lose. So the buyers and the sellers lose way more than the government gains, and that leads to, so you see this spot here, this triangular spot here, that's what we call the deadweight loss. So meaning that the buyers and the sellers lose at the expense of the government, and that leads to inefficiency in the market. So that is how taxes distort the market. And basically, when you talk about elasticity in terms of the tax, whosoever is less elastic bears the more of the burden from the tax. Okay, so for instance, most of the time the buyers don't have a choice, but even for an elastic good, the buyers are still going to buy some amounts of the good even with the tax, right? So most of the times the buyers are the ones who bear more of the tax because the sellers have that controlling power in the market to push things to us in form of higher prices. But for a good that is very elastic, highly elastic, if the sellers increase the price too much, then they're going to lose out, right? So for an elastic good, the sellers will bear more of an equal share of the tax, and for an inelastic good like salt or water or like medicines, then the sellers would bear less of the increase in the tax, right? So there will be more for an inelastic good. The sellers are more likely to push more of the tax to the buyers because they know that we don't have a choice but to buy it. But for an elastic goods, the sellers will be careful not to push too much of the tax towards the buyers because that could affect their total revenue. Remember, for an elastic good, if the price changes by too much, increases by too much, then the total revenue drops drastically because people switch to alternative goods. Okay, so that is that about elasticity and taxes. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Don't forget to do your homework right early on the time. Bye for now.